Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa, and my co-chair Sam and I are hosting this event for the hosted by the Honors Program, but open to the whole campus in this event called the Honors Symposium. And yeah, we're doing this panel on environmental justice.
Yeah, so this is part of our symposium as part of the honors program. So this panel is, we have 3 panelists today, Dr. Wilkinson, Dr. Nesmith, and Dr. Adam Kay. They're all St. Thomas faculty, and they'll be leading a discussion on environmental justice, what it means, and what we can do to make a difference. So this is the honors symposium. Every year we host the symposium, which is 2 weeks of events that is open to the whole campus. To focus on one central theme. So our central theme this year is creating change together with a special focus on sustainability and environmental issues, as well as racial issues. So that's why we're having this panel today. Yeah.
Just to get a baseline idea of what environmental justice is, the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So this movement was started by people who wanted to address the inequities of environmental protection in their communities. So communities that suffer from worse pollution, water quality, and other environmental injustices are often communities of color and other groups who are already hurt by systemic oppression in American society. And that's something that needs to change. And we're having this panel to discuss how that change might happen.
Yeah, so some of you might know this, but we were supposed to have this panel last week, but we decided to postpone it because of the timing of the Chauvin trial verdict. So we just thought that it would be important to acknowledge that that trial did happen, and that we've also had other delays because of the Dante Wright killing that has happened in our own community. There are plenty of resources on the St. Thomas website. The Chauvin trial resource page is one of them for you to learn more about what is happening and to have resources. We also thought it was important to read just a little bit of the land acknowledgement statement from St. Thomas. Since we're talking about environmental issues, it's important to discuss or to acknowledge that we are on stolen land. So I'm only going to read a very, very short part of it, but I highly recommend that everyone go to the St. Thomas website. I think it's under the diversity, equity, and inclusion page on the about the land acknowledgement. So just the short form starts off with: the University of St. Thomas occupies the ancestral and current homelands of the Dakota people, Minnesota Makoche. We also recognize the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk, whose lands were colonized by the United States and are currently occupied by the state of Minnesota. So that's just a very short statement, but I highly recommend that everyone take a full look at the statement because it's very important to acknowledge. So moving on to some kind of more technical things for the Zoom. If you're in the honors program, we ask you to change your Zoom name to include an H at the end in parentheses. This way we'll be able to know who's in the honors program so we can assign you points, because the symposium is one of the requirements of the honors program. So please, if you're in the honors program, include an H at the end. Everyone will be able to start their videos if you're comfortable to. We think that'd be great, so we can have a full discussion and seem like we're in a full classroom. So if you're comfortable with starting a video, that'd be fantastic. No one will be able to unmute themselves. We thought that this was just better for kind of control reasons, but everyone will be able to ask questions in the chat. If you have questions for our panelists, we'll open it up for some more questions at the end.
So now just to do brief introductions of our panelists, and you guys feel free to elaborate on this after I go through it. So we have Dr. Andy Nesmith, who's the director of the Bachelor's in Social Work program and has special interest in environmental justice as it relates to both interpersonal relationships and the world we live in. We also have Dr. Liz Wilkinson, an English professor with special interest in Native women literature, environmental activism, and how those two come together in ecofeminism. And Dr. Adam Kay, our biology professor researching stewardship science, and he's also the co-founder of Brightside Produce, an organization working towards an equitable local food system in a sustainable way. So now I'm going to ask you panelists, to maybe elaborate on those introductions a little and your specific areas of interest in environmental justice. And you can also answer the question, what aspect of environmental justice are you most passionate about and why? And if we want to start, we could start with Dr. Nesmith.
That's a hard question because there's a lot that I'm passionate about, but I would say probably the biggest thing is the connection between humans and all other life on this planet, our interconnectedness and the rights of nature. So the more that we're aware of our surroundings and our other living things around us, and the more that we appreciate it, the more likely we are to treat it well, and we all benefit from that. And I would say, I'm also interested in, as a social worker, we do a lot of work with people, communities that are really disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards, and getting them to be able to have, or getting us to be able to a place where they have a seat at the table where decisions are made.
Thank you. Dr. Wilkinson, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'm happy to. My interest, I guess, has a lot of sort of different facets. So I teach Native American literature, and I resisted teaching Native literature and the environment for quite a while because I think people have such a stereotypical idea of this sort of romanticized Native and nature connection. But there's so much great literature and so many great activist moments coming out of our own Indigenous population right now that there's just really no way to teach Native lit without teaching Native literature and the environment, Indigenous literature and the environment. So that's one of the ways and reasons that I'm interested in this. And also I teach in the Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies department, and I'm part of the board of the Luann Dummer Center for Women. And our topic for the year is women and the climate crisis, the climate emergency. And so we've done a lot of events focused on how the climate emergency and women's lives intersect in such important ways. And so that's part of why I'm interested in why it's part of my research. And then I'm an English professor, right? And so my whole world is language and narratives. And I think of that when we think about the differences between Indigenous languages and English, and when we think about the differences between origin stories and narratives that help shape our worldview, that we see some different and better ways to navigate and see ourselves within the environment rather than as separate from the environment. So yeah, those are just, I guess, three of the ways that I interact with the topic at hand. I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And Dr. Kay?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple things, projects that have arisen fairly recently. I run a urban agriculture network it's universities across the country, and it's all designed to help integrate urban agriculture into biology education in a way that connects biology education to community issues. So I'm passionate about that. And also I'm part of a grant that was just funded to make the Twin Cities a hub for long-term ecological research. And a main focus of that grant is to try to document and to think creatively about how to reverse the inequities that exist in terms of ecosystem services across the city. So it's generally the case that whiter, wealthier, able-bodied people are more likely to be able to access ecosystem services or not experience ecosystem disservices. So trying to think about ways of reversing that. And I think that in terms of what aspect of environmental justice that I'm most passionate about, it's definitely urban inequities and how to, just how to be a change maker to be able to try to create more equity across urban areas.
Thank you, everyone, or thank you for your great answers. That was wonderful to kind of expand that a little bit. Our overall theme of symposium this year is creating change together. So we want to focus on the St. Thomas community a little bit more to make this a little bit more, a little bit relatable, and also more so we can see what we can be doing in our own community to make a difference. So I guess our next question, we can go in the same order of panelists, would be, how does environmental justice impact the St. Thomas community? So Dr. Naismith, if you can answer first.
That's a good question. I would say at the very beginning, it affects who's at St. Thomas, both as students and as faculty or staff. Not everybody has the privilege to be able to afford and have the kind of requirements that will get you into a school like St. Thomas. And at least when I think about environmental justice, I also think about the built environment. And, we know, I don't know how much everyone knows about redlining, but just in short, we had a system that really intentionally prevented people of color from being able to live in any kind of community where they could build up any kind of equity. And people build up most of their equity through home ownership. And so that piece really, it snowballs. And so who can afford to come to St. Thomas? Who can go to schools and get the kind of resources that they need to be able to get accepted to a school like St. Thomas? And then I would also say that I kind of hinted at this before. When I think about community, I guess I would encourage all of us to think about St. Thomas community as more than about the humans that sit on this spot. So when I think about where we decide to tear down trees and natural area to build buildings versus where we decide to have open space, that affects, it's a two-way situation where it affects the creatures that live there. But then we also, if a new building goes up, for example, that cut down a lot of natural space, we don't have access to that. And the more we become distanced from nature and our environment around us, the less we, first of all, recognize that we're really a part of it and dependent on it. And second, the less we feel compelled to do something about it. So there's that piece. And the other thing I just want to say, and it's hard to say this without making the 10 steps that get you there, but the fact that COVID happened, the pandemic happened, the fact that it happened itself is related to how we treat the environment. And that same pattern is how we treat other humans. And the students around you who are getting the sickest and who know the most people who have died, they're going to be students of color. And so that is, something that's very close to us. All right, I'll stop talking and let somebody else have a turn.
Do you want me to jump in? I'll sort of piggyback off of what Dr. Naismith said. But when I immediately read this question, when you had sent it to me earlier, I flipped it, right? Rather than how does environmental justice impact St. Thomas, how does St. Thomas impact the environment and create environmental justice or injustice? And so I think we don't so much adjust to our environment or interact with our environment so much as we force the environment to adjust to us. And so my short answer is to turn that question around, right? And I think it's it's part of a mindset that we need to start working towards, right? Like, how do we think of ourselves as part of an environmental whole, part of a web, right, rather than a hierarchy? How do we curb the hubris that allows us to think that we are at the top of a hierarchy rather than an equal part of a much larger whole? And I think that we need to start thinking about not how we live on our campus or in our campus, but how we live with the whole community that we are a part of. So yeah, that's kind of what I thought of when I read that question. I'll hand off to Adam.
Yeah, I just underscore what Annie and Liz said. Those are great answers. I totally agree with both those perspectives. And the one thing I'll add too is that Liz's framing of this of St. Thomas's contribution to environmental injustice or justice. One thing just to emphasize is the fact that it just seems like higher ed today, there's just greater and greater emphasis on luxury and services and abundant food and landscaping and parking and all these things. And these are all things that create environmental pressure, and those pressures fall disproportionately on people, on the poorest people. So that's one thing, and that's not just a swipe at St. Thomas. There's, lots of organizations could be less luxurious, more efficient. But I'll also say too, just that the connection between St. Thomas and environmental justice is that, I really do feel like more so than ever that students are leaving St. Thomas fired up about, coming in fired up, but also leaving fired up about how to create environmental change. And that's what we need. We need young leadership. And if people are getting inspired at St. Thomas to really try to reframe things, then that's a major contribution to the world.
So based on what you guys been saying, I kept thinking about how this is kind of a changing mindset that needs to happen, but also what are maybe some more concrete ways that if you know some, that we could make a difference, or is there any work that you guys are currently doing that students can participate in to make a difference? And I don't know if you guys want to keep going in the same order or not, but you can just jump into if you want.
I can start. I just have to think for a second here. There's a lot of different ways. I think, first of all, I would say that although we can in some ways point the finger at large corporations and say they're the ones that are causing the biggest problems, we also can change the tone in our small ways of how people what people think is acceptable and not. The more I say, I'm not going to accept a plastic straw in my water glass at a restaurant, and other people look around me and they see that, and we start influencing each other, then we have more of an ability to influence corporations. But I would say the biggest thing that you can do as a student, in my opinion, is to be engaged in the political process and vote. Voting for people who are going to support the environment, who are going to listen to the voices of communities that are typically ignored and marginalized, can make a really big difference. And your vote really matters. We do a lot of that in social work because we do a lot of talking about advocacy. Calling our political leaders, it's so scary when we ask students to do it and then they realize it's just a regular old person on the other end. They're often willing to take that step. And I would say, living lightly. we don't need all the stuff that we have. And I've seen a huge change in students just doing, there was a time when I felt like, everybody looked at me and they're like tree hugger, and that did not mean a nice thing. And now the students are showing me their silicone reusable straws, and are making choices to do things like go vegan or change the clothes they wear, so they're not engaged in this fast fashion that makes you want to keep buying new stuff that's cheaply made on mass market. So there are a lot of things we can do individually at what we would call in social work the micro level or the meso level, and these macro level things like voting and being engaged in that bigger decision making process can really make a huge difference.
I'll jump in, and I have maybe a lot to say about this, and so apologies if I go on too long here. And I'm gonna echo some of the things that Andy said. My biggest piece of advice is, and easiest piece of advice, right, is start with yourself, right? Like, do some learning and get dirty, right? So I teach in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and we are partnering with the Women's Environmental Institute and their farm out in North Branch. And we have a 2-credit class this summer where 10 hours of experiential learning on the farm are part of the class. And we just had about 5 or 6 students come out to the farm for a half-day class, one on growing microgreens and one on growing mushrooms on a log. And we're doing stuff like that all the time. And so start with yourself, find ways to learn how to interact with the environment in really healthy, wonderful ways, and get your hands dirty. And so that's one of my sort of easy bits of advice, right? Like, become active in this. And then the next thing I have is to think about our actions and our interactions and the effects they have on the human and the non-human world, and to maybe stop thinking about those things separately. So I'm influenced very heavily by Robin Wall Kimmerer and her book Braiding Sweetgrass, right? And because I'm a language person, her information that she gives us about Anishinaabeg-Moan, which is a language that is mainly verb based, right? Like, so things that we think of as nouns are in translation in Anishinaabeg-Moan verbs, right? So it's not a bay, it translates in to be a bay, right? It's a living, breathing entity. And so what happens to our brains when we think of a bay as a fellow part of this system that we're all in, right? What happens if we think of the Mississippi as an equal partner, right? So like in 2017, New Zealand gave personhood to the Whanganui River, right? And so if you think of a river in the same way that you think of your grandma, then then it changes the way that you think, right? Like, you're not gonna toss an empty coffee cup, even a compostable empty coffee cup, on your grandma's bed and say, "Oh, Grandma, it's gonna decompose," right? Like, you're just not gonna do it, right? So I just think that you can do a lot by rethinking the way that you think, by thinking about language differently, by reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, because it'll change the way that you interact. I think that there's some great reading out there, like Leah Penniman's Farming While Black, right? Like, it's a fantastic text, and it has a chapter called White People Uprooting Racism. And so if you're wanting to be a white ally, do some reading and figure out how to be an environmental ally that way. It changed. We teach literature because it has the power to change how we think. And then I'll just echo what Dr. Nesmith said, right? Like, quit buying stuff, right? Like, be simple, right? And what Dr. K said, right? Like, we have the power to dial ourselves back. So that's my 2 cents.
One thing that I feel strongly about is that people should try to change the things that it's practical for them to change. So we can hope for an entire systems change, but we have to be able to do something that we can actually get done. And I think sometimes students don't realize the power that is within their hands, that you can make changes as an individual, but at this point in your life, your most powerful asset is that you're part of this big 15,000 person organization that you have the potential to change. You can organize, and I think students are always surprised by the fact that administrators are swayed by students often. If students organize and they that in order for St. Thomas to exist, students have to keep coming here. And if administrators feel like that students are unhappy with the situation, they will pay attention to that. So if you can start a student movement, you can enact change. And sometimes the reason that change doesn't occur is because administrators think students want things to be a certain way. So for instance, landscaping on campus, it's not going to change the world, but it's pretty symbolic. And the reason that it is maintained the way it is because administrators think or know that parents come to St. Thomas and see the traditional landscaping and say, okay, this is a place that is clean, organized. My child is going to be safe here. So if students instead organized and said, you know what, actually, we want to see large swaths of campus be unmanaged, not mowed, have it be things that are actually not requiring fossil fuels in order to be maintained. And the administrators really got the message that students wanted to see that change would happen. So the thing that I feel like there's a lot of things that could happen on campus differently. But one thing for me that seems really low-hanging fruit is to try to organize to make change in dining services, because like the all-you-can-eat buffet stuff is like that's so wasteful environmentally, and the reason that it exists is because they think that that's what students need. And so if there was a movement towards like changing the price structure for that and having things be more a la carte, that I think that's something that totally could happen. If students said that we'd like to see a special tax on meat products in order to encourage more vegetarian diets, or incentivize vegetarianism in some way by giving students price breaks on vegetarian items, that would happen too. But I remember a few years ago they started to do this Meatless Monday thing, right? And I don't know if that still exists, but it failed initially because there was such pushback by students and I think their parents too. So it's like things can change, but it has to be organized activities by students.
Just a quick thing I was going to say is a lot of what you guys said reminded me of this TED Talk I watched that was talking about the importance of spending time in nature, because just as like if you didn't spend time with like your friend, that relationship isn't going to be strong and you might not care about it as much. It's like if you go out and spend time in nature, that relationship with the environment is stronger and that people would then care about it more. And that's also, I think, why a lot of city planning is currently trying to get like more parks and green spaces, and that's why that's so important. But just a side note I was going to say.
That actually kind of leads into my next question. So I had pre-written some of these questions beforehand, and I was actually going to ask Dr. Wilkinson about the braiding sweetgrass discussion, but she covered that really well. I was able to attend the panel that she hosted on that, which was a fantastic resource, and I really am looking forward to having some time to, after the semester probably, to read the book. But I wanted to ask, so you've already talked a little bit about how our language impacts how we view nature. How does it impact the way that we see our roles as humans in nature? That if we see the nature environment as individuals, not as nouns and not just as verbs and not just nouns. How does that impact how we see ourselves? And Dr. Nesmith and Adam also talked about this a little bit. So if you guys would like to touch on this as well, I think it'd be great.
Do you want me to start it off with language? I guess I feel so fortunate because I've been exposed to multiple Indigenous languages, and some of my earliest teaching was Cherokee language. And I see some students that I recognize, so they've probably heard me tell these stories before, but in Cherokee, like the word for your mom's mom, right? Your grandmother on your mother's side is Agilishi, right? And that's because that's the grandmother that takes care of you, right? Like carries you on her back, Agilishi. And the word for honeybee is Wagalishi, right? And so that that term is the one who carries pollen on its back, right? So they're verb based, right? But they also create a relationship, right? You can't think of Agilishi without thinking of Wagilishi, right? So you can't think of your grandma without thinking of honeybees. And so I think that it frames how you navigate and how you exist within a world, right? Like as a web of interaction, rather than as, you know, environment here and humans here, right? It also, I think, helps us to think about reciprocity, right? Like the giving and the taking, right? Like, so I'm enormously influenced by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who says, yes, it's important to love the earth, but it's also important to very like in a deep-seated way realize that the earth loves us, right? That there's a reciprocity going on here, that it's not a hierarchy. And so I think language is one of the things that allows us to do that. I think it would be fantastic if we could start, you know, teaching Indigenous language here at the university, or if students had the ability to take Dakota or Anishinaabe at the U where they teach it, or, you know, at Augsburg where they teach some language classes, right? Because language shapes how we navigate the world. So I don't know if that gives you the answer you were looking for, or maybe inspires Andy or Adam to to jump in as well.
Samantha, will you restate the question? You're asking about influences in human relationships in the environment. Will you just say it again so I make sure that I'm answering what you're looking for?
Yeah, so I was kind of trying to get at what Dr. Wilkinson talked about with the interconnectedness, about not only the role that we play in nature, but that nature plays with us, and how we view the environment and how we view our role, not just in the hierarchical, and not just in the hierarchy, but in this connectedness, how that view impacts the way that we act and the way that we treat the environment.
I really think about, when I think about like environmental racism, which is just sort of a subset of environmental injustice, I think about the patterns that we play out in the way that we treat each other as humans are the same patterns that we play out in the way that we treat the environment. You know, we as humans colonized other communities of people, and we also, in many ways, colonized the land around us. And I always think about when we talk about, point the finger at, you know, invasive species, and I'm like, who's the most invasive species of them all? You know, it's really us. And sometimes what we do is we lose track of our own role. And I kind of laugh when I think about, like, of all other animals, if you put us out in nature, like, how long would we last? We've removed ourselves, you know, pretty far, but even small moments in nature, small moments out where you take a moment and feel the sunshine and the warmth and appreciate that on your body. notice the smells. I'm always saying this to the students. You've got lots of senses. You know, what do you feel? What do you smell? Even just if it's on your way to class, you are of and part of and within this environment. And these little moments can start to make a big difference. We know that it can have a really calming effect. So I will let Adam have a chance.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add a couple things that I was thinking about as you were both talking, and students who it's nice to see several students who've been in classes with me in the past. But one thing that I just wanted to emphasize is that I don't know if everybody is aware of this, but scientists now describe this period that we're in as the beginning of a new geologic age, the Anthropocene. And that's defined by the fact that human impact on the environment is so severe that it's actually changing the Earth system. And so the idea that arises from that is that we not only are within nature, we are actually the driver of nature at the same time. So that we're intimately connected. I think it used to be the case that we sort of thought of we've able to separate ourselves from nature, but now with all the feedbacks that we are creating, we realize that we are actually intimately connected to this, and it's creating the challenge for humanity, probably the greatest challenge humanity's ever faced. And I think that I was just going to tell another story about my kids. Like I have two young kids at home, and we always from the beginning have emphasized that they're animals, right? And they will they'll now, like 3 and 6, they'll tell people whenever they hear somebody say like, oh, there's humans and then there's animals. Like, no, humans are animals too, right? And they'll gladly talk about that. But I think that understanding how human nature is connected to the broader biology can be really revealing, and it's honestly our hope moving forward. I mean, we have to be able to have a better understanding of ourselves if we're actually going to move this world to something that's sustainable.
Thank you guys for those responses. Just to get a little bit more specific into each of your work, I was going to ask Dr. K if you wanted to talk about Brightside Produce a little and how that connects to environmental justice.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for asking about that. So Brightside has been around for 7 years. But it's changed form quite a bit in the last year. So Brightside's mission is to try to eliminate food insecurity in urban areas, and it focuses on delivering fruits and vegetables to underserved communities. The main focus has been on corner stores in underserved neighborhoods, but it also has a pretty extensive delivery service to households, and it's a pay what you can service. So households pay, as little as $1 to get a big bundle of produce every week. And it's all fueled by donations and volunteers, many of whom are St. Thomas students. And so for me, it's always been trying to bring a bunch of people together to help to try to address one underlying social injustice, the food insecurity issue. I always think justice is the appropriate word, and sometimes people have pushed back on that use of food justice because they just don't get it. But it's like the idea that if you're in a poor neighborhood, that it's actually harder and more expensive to get a healthy item, that's an injustice. And so just trying to address that. And I feel like there's strong overlap with broader environmental issues, because it's the same pattern where the services in in some neighborhoods are just not as extensive as they are in richer neighborhoods. The access to food, access to clean water, access to green space, it's all interconnected. And so actually trying to galvanize people, get young people a chance to work together to try to do something to be able to address it is what I'm passionate about, and it's really the basis for Brightside Produce.
I'd love to jump in and tag on that. So is it okay if I screen share just for a second? Okay,
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, so this is the Women's Environmental Institute. And so they're doing work much like I think what Adam is talking about. And so one of the things they do is called Veggie RX. And basically it's the thought that, you know, people who are struggling with their health need healthy food in order to get better. And so a lot of the produce that the Women's Environmental Institute creates goes to Veggie RX. And so I think that, you know, if you're looking for a place to volunteer, it's part of, it's one of the accepted volunteer organizations through University of St. Thomas. And, you know, once again, we'll be doing it a lot of volunteer work through Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And that 2-credit class has that 10-hour volunteer component. So it's just a very concrete thing that you can do if you feel so inclined. But yeah, I would very much encourage people to just hop over to the WEI website and see what they're all about. Because I mean, we can't have too many of these things, right? Like working for food justice. And that's the title of the course, Women, Food Justice, and the Environment. So I'm on board with the food justice phrase.
Awesome. So thank you guys, or thank you panelists. I don't know why I keep saying that, but thank you for sharing both of those resources. It's wonderful to be able to know more about what we can do to make a difference here in St. Thomas. And those are 2 great resources. So before asking this question, I just wanted to remind everyone here that we will be opening up for kind of more open discussion, more questions later on. So please, if you have any questions, please throw them into the chat. You can either, you know, just direct the question to everyone or at me or Alyssa, and we'll be able to ask the panelists. So please continue to think about questions that you'd love to ask our great panelists. So this next question is a little bit more directed at Dr. Naismith, particularly in your work in social work, but it's obviously something that everyone so far has touched upon. But why is environmental justice important, especially when working with vulnerable populations?
You know, a few years ago, I did a random survey of licensed social workers in the state of Minnesota, of which, by the way, there's 10,000, so there's a lot. And when I asked them about what was going on with their clients, what I kept hearing, and I was asking them about the environment and environmental justice, but what I kept hearing was that they might have been tasked with this job of helping a couple that maybe has problems with violence to deal with that when they've got arsenic in their drinking water. And their priority of how to have healthier interactions just didn't really exceed the stress of having water that was poisoning them and their children. Or when I'm talking to someone who is suffering from depression, and the social worker's task is to help them, you know, develop mechanisms and ways to deal with their own, you know, with their depression. And they say, you know, I can't even think about it when my apartment is right next to a Jiffy Lube and we share a wall, and I'm listening to drilling and this crazy sound all day long, and I can never have this moment of peace. Sometimes they seem like unrelated and separate things, but if we're not paying attention to the influences of one's environment on the rest of their lives, then we're really not dealing with the whole picture. And now I would say more than ever, we're starting to really see people with eco-grief, eco-anxiety, nostalgia, that there is this sense of not being, just feeling hopeless sometimes regarding the environment, and we have to help people figure out how to get past that. And a lot of it is about being reconnected again to the environment. So in social work, when we're dealing with people, we always say that we have to deal with them in the context of their environment, their social environment, their natural environment, their built environment.
It's funny that you bring up solastalgia, because I actually wrote, I was in a creative writing class and I wrote a short story about that, about how I felt that when trees around my grandma's house were cut down. But so going on this thread about how we kind of treat the environment, how we treat people, I was wondering if Dr. Wilkinson, could you talk about ecofeminism a little bit?
Sure. So yeah, I'll be teaching a class in ecofeminism at the graduate level in the fall. And so it's interesting, this term ecofeminism. I think it was kind of like hot in the 1970s, and it was definitely thought of as like sort of a white women's term, right? Like this idea of ecofeminism. And so it gets bashed around a little bit in the 1990s, but in the 20-teens, it starts to make a comeback, and partly because of this cohort that y'all are in, really thinking about it in an intersectional way. And in fact, one of the best definitions that I've seen comes from a journal out of Canada that's focused on queering ecofeminism. And so I thought I would just have their definition at the ready for y'all. So they write that ecofeminism, as both an intersectional movement and critical theory, is useful for analyzing oppressive hierarchical systems and seeing how they are intertwined. Ecofeminism is an activist movement and a literary theory that links the oppression of women and minorities to the oppression of nature. So that's kind of the crux of it, right? Scholars discuss negative impacts of heterosexism, heteronormativity, and things of that nature on society and on how we understand the natural world, right? So queer ecofeminists are critiquing structural hierarchies, are critiquing absolute binaries, and are definitely critiquing this idea of separating the natural and the unnatural world, right? And so when we think of things in that way, it's kind of funny to me because, right, it seems to me that seems new, right? But it's only new if we're looking at it from a Western worldview. If we think about it from an indigenous worldview, that's as old as indigeneity. So yeah, that maybe gives you a definition of ecofeminism.
So I don't know if Dr. Naismith or Adam have anything to add on to that before we move on to our next question that we have prepared. But I wanted to ask a kind of tough question. I wanted to ask, for each of you, what do you see as the biggest environmental concerns right now? And you can tie this in because this is kind of a big, wide, all-encompassing question. If you want to tie it into like your current research projects, if you're doing anything at St. Thomas, any courses that you're teaching that you're kind of focusing in on a certain issue. But yeah, what do you see as your biggest environmental concerns right now? And then what can we as students do to address it? And we can go again, the first order that we did, Dr. Naismith, and then Wilkinson, and then Adam.
Oh, there's so many answers to that question. I mean, on the one sense, we could say human hubris. On another sense, you could say, I mean, if you're looking for answers like carbon in the air and our you know, what's happening with global warming, we could talk about all the implications of that, but they're all interconnected is the problem. We can look at what's happening with carbon emissions, for example, and all the things that contribute to that. But the fact that we're tearing down forests as fast as possible also plays a role into that. And the fact that we're putting poisons into our water and our land may not be contributing to global warming, but it has this overall trend toward the global environmental crisis. But I think when I think of the biggest problem is it's that we think we have time. We think there's still, I hear a lot of, well, you know, maybe my children will. No, you right now, all of us who are sitting in this room, all of us right now, COVID should be a wake-up call. That's because of us. And there are more viruses to come if that are trapped in the polar ice caps. And so when I hear, I'm sure all of you now have heard Greta Thunberg. She is absolutely amazing. And that's one of the things that I really like to emphasize to my students is that there's and young people have really led a lot of powerful movements. And you should never be saying to yourself, I'm not experienced enough, or I don't have that power. And just to emphasize what Dr. K was saying about that students can make a huge difference in campuses, that is, I just want to second that. That is absolutely true. Faculty, what we have to say is not anywhere near as powerful as the students, as the consumers. But we've got to stop thinking we have time and we can kick back and relax. I always think of like the Titanic where, it's sinking and somebody's saying, let's get another order of cocktails. No, we have to change our behavior and start right now and act like the house is on fire because the house is on fire.
It's hard or maybe easy to follow that up. Maybe the biggest problem is that we don't think we have agency when we actually do, that we are continually sort of placed into position where we're so overworked with so many things and so many distractions that it's easy to fall into an apathetic sort of state. But I think that every small and large thing that we do can make a difference. And I think it has to. And I think that we have to create different narratives, narratives where we see ourselves as empowered. Yeah, I think that maybe is my biggest contribution.
I kind of feel like I appreciate the complexity, but I think that I have a really simple answer to this. It's climate change, and I also don't think that I've seen anything that gives me a lot of hope that this is a problem that's going to get solved. So that doesn't prevent me from trying to do as much as I can and to inspire other people and work with other people to do as much as they can. But I'm really pessimistic about the ability of humanity to deal with this issue. And it's an existential threat. I can't see it as any other way. So I hate to be so pessimistic, but it's beyond critical, and I'm just not seeing enough in terms of the change that needs to happen.
Can I just add one more thing? Because I appreciate that. I share a lot of your feelings about that, Dr. K. I think that it's hard not to feel like we've already passed the point of no return. And I would say we have to die trying. It almost doesn't matter whether or not we're past the point of no return. We just have to try. That's all we've got. That's all we've got. And so we have to try, and we all can take a part of it, not just in doing our own small pieces, but also in spreading the word, in talking about it, and saying to other people, I'm not going to buy that product. I'm not going to drive the car. I'm going to walk. Say it out loud. Let other people hear you. Vote. All of these things. Because if we don't try, then it's a foregone conclusion. It's a mathematical certainty. that we're not going to survive as a species. But if we try really hard, there's a chance. There's a chance. And I would say, isn't that worth it? What's more important than all life on Earth?
So kind of, I'm hoping this will have an optimistic tone too, but I was wondering if any of your fields, have you noticed a change in them since environmental justice or maybe even sustainability has become a little bit more well-known? Do you guys see, have you seen changes in your fields at all?
Well, I seek it out. So, but I think, yeah, there's some great narratives, fiction, poetry, like that speak to this. And if people have taken classes with me, they know that I think that everything is rhetorical, right? And so everything has at base a goal of changing how an audience thinks or feels or acts. And I think, yeah, we are getting a lot of really important narratives. We're writing different stories.
When I started graduate school in ecology in the 90s, my mom asked me, her comment was basically like, what are you doing with your life? Why don't you do something more useful for humans? And that was a pretty prevalent attitude. I don't think that there aren't that many people that feel the same way now. I think that it's generally regarded that environmental issues are of paramount importance. So that's great. I mean, I think there's so much more being done now to try to address issues. And likewise, I've seen a ton of change on campus, student interests. Some of the programs that have been started on campus, the sustainability office, galvanizing a lot of change. Like there's been a lot of change happening. I just don't know if I've seen the kind of radical change, like questioning perpetual economic growth and talking about abandoning combustion engines and fossil fuel use. Like I just like that part is not mainstream yet, but yeah, maybe it's coming.
In social work, I've seen a lot of change. I mean, first of all, I sort of alluded to this before. We've always talked about ourselves as being a profession that always sees a person in the environment, but we've always meant social environment over the years. That it's what your family is like, what your community is like, your interactions with your school, and we're a little slow coming to it. Even though one of our founding people, Jane Addams, was actually pretty heavily involved in environment in terms of inside cities, having waste disposal and things like that to make, sanitation. But now in our competencies, we've added some pieces to it. Social work, by the way, is very like at the heart of our professional values is social justice. So a huge piece of what we talk about in basically every single course is about social justice. It was not a big leap to go to environmental justice, except that sometimes making change that ends up in writing that is really going to help have some teeth to it can be a little bit harder. And I was in a group that was really pushing to change our core competencies. We have a list of them as part of our profession and part of our licensing regulations and our accreditation. And now we've integrated environmental justice into two different pieces of that, so that we now have to teach it. We have to talk about its importance. We have to talk about it in reference to policy, and we have to talk about it in reference to direct practice. And at first, that seemed really radical to a lot of people. And now I think it's more natural. And I definitely have moments where I feel like the students are ahead of me and what they're keeping up with and paying attention to and what they're trying to do. So I do think it doesn't seem so radical. It seems more mainstream. And we kind of needed to get to that point before people will really start integrating this into their work. So that's a change that I think is actually much more recent in social work. We just had that big change happen in 2015, but I think that's going to snowball to really have an impact in most of our classes and curricula across the country.
Awesome. So thank you for your answers. We're now moving on to audience questions. So audience, we have some questions. Please throw them in the chat, either to me or Alyssa. But I actually have a couple already. So kind of along these lines of institutional changes that have been happening, Lauren asked, in your opinion, what steps should the US government take right now to mitigate the effects of climate change and other forms of environmental justice? So this wasn't directed at a specific panelist, but if anyone wants to start it off, or we can go in order again.
Do you mind reading that question one more time?
Yeah, sorry, I probably read it a little fast.
Well, there were also pop-ups coming up from chat, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. What steps should the US government take right now to mitigate the effects of climate change and other forms of environmental justice?
I think that some of the things that our new President Biden is doing are definitely moving us in the right direction. If I recall correctly, and I might get my data not quite right, but I think it was a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030, which is 9 years. Stepping that up is a big piece of it. I think that we can provide a lot of incentives at the US level to not be so wasteful, not to be having so much packaging, to encourage car manufacturers, and we're moving in that direction as well, to have zero emission vehicles. But we need to step up the pace. We need to, I'm a little bit of a broken record, but we need to act like the house is on fire and take some radical changes. Yes, all of our lives are the way that we deal with our daily lives will change when we can't just throw everything out that comes at us, and we have to be a little more thoughtful. But I think, we can live very fulfilling, happy lives doing that. And so I would like to see more laws about waste, about toxins that are allowed to go in the environment, and about CO2, and then also water. The way that we are using and wasting our water is not going to last us as long as we would like to see that happen.
I'm just going to hand off to Adam on this one, because I don't think I have more than Andy and Adam can input on this.
Yeah, I think that I also feel a little reserved about answering this one in terms of because of lack of knowledge, because that countrywide policy is a little intimidating to me. But I've read a lot of good things about carbon taxes as being effective tools. It's not politically popular in the US. It has been tried elsewhere, but putting a price on carbon and having market forces to help to incentivize low carbon aspects of the economy is, I've heard, it can be an effective tool. So that would be really good. But there's also the just no-brainer things, like increasing the requirements of car manufacturers to make cars more efficient, increasing a lot of the putting pressure on industries to increase efficiencies in various ways. So anyway, I don't know. I think the economic policies to help incentivize low carbon industries, and definitely work to incentivize the development of sustainable power generation, more wind, more geothermal, more solar, for sure.
Awesome, thank you. So I don't know if Alyssa has been getting any direct messages, but I've gotten a few. And one that Alex asked earlier, that kind of has to do with the systemic changes a little bit, is how do you suggest we go about changing the narrative or trying to create a dialogue about this topic with those who don't necessarily agree with its importance? And kind of to expand on that, what are some strategies we can use to open up that conversation and help people to understand its importance and discuss ways to make our society better? So if we want to see these changes kind of systemically, we need to try and get people on board. How do we open up those conversations with people who don't necessarily agree that it's an issue?
I think the best way to get somebody to listen to you is for you to listen to them. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of thinking about lately, I'm talking about my classes as well as radical empathy, really stepping into the shoes of another person to understand why they hold the views that they do, especially when it's somebody who believes in something really, really different from you. And if you can kind of imagine really being in their place, really trying to, what would be the argument for why they feel this way, and be able to explain it back to them in a way that's so good that they would say, hey, you make some good points. Once you can do that, and somebody feels like you understand them, then they're going to be much more likely to listen to you and hear you out. The other thing I would say is sharing moments in nature with other people, to encouraging others to go out and appreciate. I'm sitting here, I'm in the woods, looking out at the trees, appreciating what's around you. Now, I don't know that those small things are going to make a systemic change, in a sort of very slow trickle up. So I would say you have to partner it with some of these macro level things like voter engagement. I said it before, but I'll say it again, voter engagement. Who is in power makes a huge, huge difference on all of these decisions about what happens with, carbon output in the US and how we treat other natural resources.
I think that's exactly it. Pardon my cat. My cat's name is Uh-oh. Anyway, I think, yeah, I'll just partner on what Andy said. I think one of the reasons that people resist is because they don't feel empowered to make any change, right? Like they just throw up their hands. And so, maybe one strategy is to provide some small thing that makes an impact, right? Like volunteering, like getting out in nature, something where a person can make a difference and then get that good feeling and keep it going, right? Let it snowball into something bigger and bigger. And, as Andy has said a couple times, right? Like it starts with you, but you have to be vocal about your own activism so that it, spreads to a larger community and a larger community and a larger community. We have to have a sea change, right? The narrative, we get to rewrite the story. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents on that.
And I guess I'll just say that I try to resist this, but sometimes I lose patience with this. The idea of trying to understand resistance to this. Like I just saw a stat, and this is not going to be, I'll say something a little jagged here, but like I just saw a stat that something like 50% of Republican voters said that they were absolutely convinced that they weren't going to get vaccinated for COVID. And it's like I've had these conversations with conservative relatives, and it's like, how exactly are you supposed to present the information that would make them do something that is focused on something that benefits the broader community? It's like, it's just exasperating. And I feel like with this, sometimes I want to be understanding, and sometimes I feel like I want to have youth become much more activated to have control of political power, and then to put in policies that will result in this change, such that the economic structures are such that the the economic choice is the one that's the green choice, and that's the only way of bringing it about. Not that we're going to convince everybody to believe in this, because I've actually lost a bit of faith in that.
We also have a question from Peyton saying, taxing on environmental damage is a good way. However, I heard that it might disproportionately affect poorer communities. Do you guys know a compromise to this?
Yeah, definitely. You can set it up with the incentive structure such that justice is emphasized. It's just a matter of how it's done. So I think sometimes, the arguments are presented in a way that it's like, this is going to disproportionately affect poor people, but sometimes like that's it's not an honest critique. It's because you can, just like any taxation system, you can have it be as progressive as you want it to be.
Sorry, Marie was the one who asked that. Peyton has a different question. We talked about environmental justice in Minnesota through mitigating food deserts for people of color and disadvantaged communities. I know other environmental issues in America are access to safe drinking water, vicinity to polluting factories, and climate refugees from natural disasters such as forest fires, hurricanes, and floods. How do these types of issues present in Minnesota, and are there ways to combat them besides minimizing CO2 and things like that, and pressuring representatives? These are some big questions, so thank you guys. Thank you in the audience for asking these.
I think that's an amazing question, and I feel like every one of those issues has its own individual challenges and things that people could get involved in to address. They're all things with somewhat distinctive ways of addressing, and so things like the contamination that disproportionately affects poor people, like affordable housing policies, policies that require affordable housing to be distributed across cities instead of being concentrated in poor neighborhoods, like things like that. But then also mitigation to reduce like there's ways of treating contaminated soils, and then just like more environmental regulation on industry so that you don't get further pollution in poor neighborhoods. But each one of the issues that were raised there has individual specific solutions that people can get involved in.
All right, so I have one more question from the audience, and this will probably, I think, be our last audience question before we kind of move on to our final kind of closing question. So thank you to everyone who's asked questions. But this individual from the chat said that you've indirectly highlighted the do's of environmental advocacy. What are some don'ts about advocating environmental justice to the community, and how can we not turn people off when it comes to environmental advocacy? So this is again getting at getting people involved and making sure that it's an inclusive community that isn't off-putting to anyone.
That's such a good question, and I don't know that I have the perfect answer for it. But the putting people off, I think sometimes comes back to also pushing your opinion before. It's a little bit like what I was saying before, pushing your opinion before you know that you have somebody who's actually actively listening to you. And sometimes it's not, we can talk until we're blue in the face, and our talking isn't, we do better by role modeling. We do better by our actions, that things that people can see and recognize, than just by trying to change people's mind with words. But the other thing that I would say is that you can never underestimate the degree to which you do or say something to someone who seems like they're not receiving the message. And you might be the first of several in a line that gives this message, and it takes them 7 times before they start to realize, I keep hearing this, I keep noticing this. Now that this has been pointed out to me so many times, maybe I should be thinking about it. Most of us don't take a 180 turn in our behavior just because somebody said that we should, or a couple people said that we should. We have to think about it. We have to conclude that we came to this decision on our own. But we have to keep talking. We have to keep role modeling. We have to keep engaging.
I think I'll just go back to what Andy has said before. Listen, and let Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, marginalized people's voices be at the forefront, and step back from any sort of swooping in and fixing and any sort of self-aggrandizement. There are a lot of projects out there run by community peoples that need your help, and so just be a worker bee, and like one that comes to mind is the WEI is working on a project with Phillips neighborhood, and those community peoples are leading the way, and all the volunteers are just there to do whatever they're told to do to make things work. And so, yeah, I mean, things to not do, yeah, don't feel like you need to take charge. Listen first, and then do what's needed.
That 100%, 100%. I also think that at the same time, I'm thinking like don't avoid conflict either. Like I'm just thinking about how many family gatherings and other gatherings I've gone to where people didn't say anything, and like, well, like there are things that need to be changed. So who's going to stick their neck out and help to promote that change? It might be uncomfortable. It might make people uncomfortable. That's doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. So I 100% agree with what Liz said in terms of if you're in a privileged position, then you have to understand your role and make sure that you're not taking leadership when you shouldn't be. But I hope everybody will take a chance wherever they have that opportunity to actually try to shake things up a bit and make people a bit uncomfortable, because change does need to happen.
So thank you. That was the last of our audience questions. So this will probably be our last question for the panelists today. So if there's one thing that you like someone to take away from today's panel, what would you like it to be? And to kind of echo something that was from the braiding sweetgrass conversation that Dr. Wilkinson led, is what would you tell your college-age self about this issue? And what would you like your college-aged self to be able to do about this issue? And we can go through the panelists again so everyone can have a chance to kind of make some closing statements, kind of closing summary.
Going first means I have less time to think about this. So if either of you two have something first.
I know I had the sweet spot. You had to go first and Adam had to go last. I've totally gotten the sweet spot here. I feel like I've just been sort of a broken record just because we pair with Women's Environmental Institute, but I think that I would tell my college-age self to get involved with an organization doing good works, listen, learn, and then become the cog in that wheel that does the most good, right? Use my talents in the way that they do the most good. And I, there are some really good organizations out there. Find the talent that you can contribute and get to work doing it in big and small ways. Be kind to yourself, be kind to each other.
I would say to not be afraid. I think my college age self, I probably would have been a little bit intimidated to speak up and speak out. And I think the reference to speaking to family members, to people around you, those are the people who you probably have some of the biggest influence on. To take action in whatever way works for you. We all are different, and we all have different ways that we're the most comfortable or effective at. Some people are like, yeah, let me get my, roll my sleeves up and get my hands dirty. And others are, I want to be, working more behind the scenes, whatever it is, but be doing something, because we just can't afford not to. We just can't afford not to. The urgency is so great, that hopefully that can overcome your fears, because really we all need to be speaking up and doing something, whatever that thing is that you can do for given your level of comfort and what you're best at.
Oh, awesome. I'm going to actually make it a 3-person team here, because I'm feeling the exact same way. That's what I was thinking, is that I would say to my college age self, like, have an incredible sense of urgency. I've had that urgency maybe for the last 10 years, but I didn't have it as much when I was younger. And it needs to be outwardly focused. It needs to be everything that you can do to help make a difference. And I love Liz's suggestion about finding something, getting involved, be that cog in that system, and make as much difference as you can. The more you take on like that, the more you'll be able to do in every aspect of your life as well. It's not a trade-off, it's a win-win.
Awesome. So I think that's all the questions that we have. So we can do a virtual round of applause for the panelists. Thank you guys so much for coming here to talk today. It was wonderful. We have a few resources that we'd love to talk about first before people start heading off, because as we talked about, getting involved, that's super important. So Ethan actually earlier threw into the chat information about the program that he's working with here at St. Thomas. So I'd highly encourage everyone to look back through the chat to find Ethan's announcement and to message him if you're interested. We'll hopefully also be getting resources. We can ask the panelists potentially to send us some of the resources that they talked about. Now, Dr. Wilkinson talked about that program with the Food RX, and Dr. Kays talked about the Brightside Produce, especially. So we will try and compile some of that information, including the information that Ethan put into the chat, into potentially a Canvas announcement or some other source, so that everyone can have access to it to get involved here on St. Thomas.
And just one more reminder that if you're in the honors program, please put an H at the end of your name. And if you're watching with a roommate, put their name in as well. And yeah, just thank you guys. Thank you panelists so much for taking the time to talk to us and dealing with rescheduling and everything. And yeah, we'll close for tonight.
Yes, thank you, everyone.